Mirrors by Greensearcher. Chapter 24, Part 1. Is everything to your satisfaction, Your Majesty? King Victor stood in the Hall of Arms, surveying the surroundings with thirsty eyes. The handsome beard of his youth now sat wiry and unkempt against his neck, itself now significantly less defined than it had been a decade before. Even the expensive clothes he wore couldn't hide the man's deterioration in health. Heavy bags sat beneath his eyes, skin greying and stomach hanging far over his belt from a decade of unrestrained food and drink, supported, of course, by the extortion of his people. Ignoring Lumiere's question, King Victor paused before a large painting in the shadows, a depiction of Judas, frozen forever in the moment of his treacherous kiss. Christ's gaze was cast down, and he seemed to almost be staring at Victor amidst the betrayal. The king glared at the painting, then looked away. "My brother's wretched wife was far too fond of such pious scenery," he huffed, waving an irritated hand in the air. "Remove them all." Lumiere's nostrils flared. Luckily, the king had his back to him at that moment. "Of course, my king," he said through gritted teeth. Lumiere had been chosen for such a task, given his innate ability to put on a show, but grovelling at Victor's feet for the past months was wearing even on his resilient nerves. "The treasury next," Victor ordered. Lumiere nodded, moving deeper down the hall as the king and a troop of men followed behind. In the heart of the castle, Lumiere stopped before a set of thick double doors. Pulling a set of keys from his belt, he unlocked the entrance and pulled it open with no small effort. Not one man offered to help. Huffing, Lumiere eventually managed to crack it wide open enough for Victor to enter. The king brushed past him in earnest, leaving his men to guard the hall. "Light," Victor ordered gruffly. Lumiere reached for the nearest candlestick. It shifted in his hand, for he was not the only servant working from the inside. Setting the living light on a desk, Lumiere took his keys once again and opened the heavy chests at Victor's request. The man buried his hands in each one, emptying the carefully organized pouches and examining the coins in the dim light. "Satisfactory, I suppose," he muttered, "though not as much as I was expecting." "Taxes were lower under your brother's rule," Lumiere explained with no little irritation, "and what coin came here did not stay long, for he put much of it back towards the aid of his people." Victor narrowed his eyes, looking back at him. "And what do you think of that servant?" he asked darkly. Lumiere felt a bead of sweat drip down his back, immediately recognizing his mistake. He sucked in a breath. "I think he was a fool," he lied with all the conviction he could muster. Victor watched him for a long moment. "Indeed," he said quietly. He moved across the room, sweeping aside a neat stack of financial records and emptying another pouch of coins on the cleared surface. He spread the gold on beneath his palm, picking up one piece and examining it with interest. "Remind me," he said, staring at the coin in his fingertips. "Why did you come to me?" Lumiere swallowed. "It seems I am not all without a soul to wait upon, Your Majesty," he replied, voice hollow in the shadows. Victor finally looked up and smirked. "Ah, yes. Your kind were truly born into this world to serve." Lumiere stared at the king's neck. Thick, splotched, just waiting for two hands to wrap around it and squeeze. He grit his teeth hard. Victor raised a brow, looking around the room. "Is something burning?" Lumiere sniffed. Yes, something was indeed burning. And in that moment he realized his head felt unusually warm. Reaching up quickly, he smothered the smoke, coughing nervously. "You have got to pull yourself together." Victor was watching him with suspicion, but looked up when a loud thump rang out from the hall. It was soon followed by two more. Sweeping past Lumiere, the king stepped back into the corridor. Lumiere heard him move but 2 paces, then stop. All was still. "So soon?" Lumiere thought with surprise. With caution, he stepped back outside himself. A dozen bodies spotted the floor, amid twice as many roses. Each fallen soldier stared ahead, unblinking, eyes glazed over as they sat limply against the walls and lay motionless along the long carpet. Victor stood in the midst of them, his own eyes fixed in a trance on the figure in the shadows. A creature stood there, hunched over and hooded, sucking in a sharp, raspy breath. It took a slow step towards them, exhaling slowly. The sound rang like death off the cold walls. With another breath, the stranger straightened, hood falling back to reveal the most ghastly sight Lumiere had ever seen. A corpse from the castle cemetery would have been a more welcome sight. With another rough breath, the monster began to change. Slowly, painfully, new skin filling in the gaps in its cheeks, hair growing from bald patches across its head. "Is this really her?" Lumiere thought in horror. She continued to change, a bit each time with each breath, finally reaching a state where she appeared more alive than dead. "King Victor," she breathed at last. She ran her hands down her figure, changing the rags she wore into a deep, shimmering black gown. Sighing, she looked up with eyes of fire. "Thank you for such an abundant supply. You may step aside now." Fur brushed her fingertips, her forehead. "Adam?" Belle said groggily. Cracking one eye open, she quickly realized her error. "Oh, Max," she blushed. It was an honest mistake, she supposed, for Adam, in the form she had long known him in, still filled her dreams, despite his new humanity. Max was scratching at the tent door now, anxious to be let out. Rubbing the sleep from her eyes, Belle quickly dressed and threw on her boots before unfastening the canvas flap. Max ran out quickly and took care of business as Belle slowly followed. It wasn't quite dawn, the eastern hills just barely showing the light of the sun, and the landscape grey and covered with dew. It was a cold morning for June, and she wrapped her arms around herself, though it was memories from the night before that warmed her the most. They walked through the rows of tents, illuminated by nothing but quiet stars. Camp was still now, a happy kind of peace replacing the joyous celebration from earlier that evening. When they reached Belle's tent, they stopped, holding each other's hands again, hearts still racing from their newfound intimacy. "Good night," Adam whispered at last. "Good night." Despite the word, however, Adam didn't pull away. Instead, he played with her long hair, loose and tangled, the ribbon long since lost somewhere along the shore. "Did I tell you I like your hair this way?" he asked. "You're changing the subject," Belle smiled. He sighed and leaned down, resting his cheek against her head. "It's just, I'm afraid if I go to bed, this is all going to end," he admitted. He'd said it in mirth, though Belle thought she caught a bit of lingering fear in his voice. Belle wanted to assure him that it wouldn't, but the truth was, she felt some of the same fear herself. "Maybe," she started. She pulled back, absently smoothing out the front of his shirt. "Maybe you could sleep here tonight?" she asked. She smoked a little. "It wouldn't be the first time." Adam's eyes grew wide, scanning the empty space around them. "Well, that was different," he said nervously. "Why?" Belle asked, feigning innocence. He looked back at her and raised a brow. "You know why." He glanced towards the tents further away. "It's just, your father likes me right now, but I'm fairly certain if he finds me here, I'm a dead man." "Well, all right," Belle shrugged. She leaned up and kissed him on the cheek before pulling away. "Good night." "Oh, good night," he said lamely, looking a little deflated as she ducked inside her tent. Belle paused inside, She only had to wait a few short moments before hearing the canvas flap open behind her.
Wait,
Adam whispered, poking his head inside.
I changed my mind.
Belle bit back a smile. Give me a moment. I need to change into something dry. He nodded quickly.
I do too,
he said before shutting the flap again. Belle heard his footfalls race off towards the other side of camp. Stifling a laugh, she pulled off her sea-soaked clothes and shimmied into a clean shift and nightdress. She had just dimmed her lantern when she heard the quiet tap at the entrance. Pulling it open, she found Adam's hand in the darkness and pulled him inside. Her cot was built for one, so instead they gathered together every blanket in the small space and buried themselves inside. Adam hummed deeply, running his fingers over her head and through the tips of her hair, brushing against her back.
Temptress,
he whispered. Belle grinned, relaxing against his warmth. It's a special occasion, he hummed again.
It is.
His fingers found her shoulder then, tracing soft circles against her skin where her gown had slipped down. He breathed deeply before reaching around and pulling her close.
Good night, Belle,
he breathed, placing a soft kiss to the forehead.
I love you.
I love you too. A horse's nickering broke through the memory, bringing Belle back to the present. She looked towards their temporary corral, just as a distant figure hopped over its fence. Smiling, she crossed the campsite on light feet. Adam, finally donning his boots, stepped carefully towards a bright white mare, a saddle and stirrups over one arm and a heavy cloak over his shoulders. The horse barely acknowledged him as he approached.
Olive,
he said slowly, setting the saddle aside and stepping close.
Hey, girl. It's me.
Olive's ears perked up at his voice, finally turning her head and staring him straight in the eyes.
Hey,
he said again, brushing his fingers through her mane.
It's me, Adam. I'm different.
Olive leaned closer then, sniffing his collar as he rubbed his hand over her coat like he always did. Olive's ears perked up further, and suddenly she was nuzzling his neck, nearly knocking him over in her excitement. Adam laughed, wrapping both arms around her neck and hugging her tight. Belle watched from a distance, smiling warmly and wishing she had brought her sketchbook. Instead, she focused on creating a mental image of the scene for a later depiction.
"Wanna go for a ride?"
Adam asked, Olive eagerly. She pressed her wet nose to his face and he laughed again, tugging off his cloak and throwing it over the gate before retrieving the equipment to saddle her up. A minute later, he stood motionless at her side, staring at the stirrup. And then, with some hesitation, he stepped into it and swung himself into the seat. He sat tall, sucking in a deep breath that filled his chest. Belle now flushed for the 100th time since his return. Goodness, how regal he looked! The image was soon spoiled, however, for Adam immediately grabbed the reins, squatted low, and urged Olive towards the nearest field. Ignoring the closed corral, they jumped the fence and took off like lightning through the tall grass. Halfway across the field, Adam's loud hoot of joy was carried back on the wind. Belle herself laughed. She'd never seen him like this. And how fun it was! Approaching the corral, she retrieved his cloak and pulled it around herself. She pressed her nose to the fabric, breathing in his smell. Strange how it hadn't changed much from what it was before. He must have caught sight of her, for just a few minutes had passed before he guided Olive behind the gate and was jumping out of the saddle. "Belle!" he said excitedly, landing on clumsy feet and throwing his arms around her, pinning the wooden fence between them. His heart was racing from the thrill of the ride, breath warm against her cheeks.
"Good morning,"
he mumbled, kissing her cheek quickly before attempting to climb the gate without fully releasing her. Belle chuckled at him. "Good morning," she said happily, glad when he finally made it over and encased her in his full warmth. "When did you get up?"
"About an hour ago," he said. "Sorry, you looked so concerned that I didn't want to wake you up."
Belle smiled. "You must have slept well. I noticed you don't snore anymore," she teased.
"Yes, I do,"
he said, not missing a beat. "What?"
He chuckled. "Just a little. It's cute."
He noticed his cloak around her then, and leaned close.
Always stealing my clothes.
He breathed in her ear, one finger playing with the cloak's tassel and briefly brushing the skin of her throat in the process. Finders keepers, she whispered back, letting that pleasant, still new feeling rush through her as he drew close.
Well, Your Highness, I must say everything is going just swimmingly.
Adam froze before their lips met, eyes growing wide. He looked quickly over her shoulder and Belle followed his gaze. There stood Cogsworth, a small paper pad in one palm as he jotted several notes onto its surface.
We'll be starting for Peruseville just after breakfast, my lord. Cogsworth.
Adam deadpanned, but Madame Agatha expressed a desire to check you over before we depart. Cogsworth went on, so if you'd come with me, I can escort you to
Cogsworth,
Adam said again, cutting him off. The man finally looked up. Yes, my prince? Adam sucked in a breath, barely containing his annoyance.
Cogsworth, I have been waiting to kiss this woman for months.
Oh, Adam, Belle whispered.
So do you think this could possibly wait 5 minutes?
Cogsworth looked up at them straight on, as if only becoming aware of what he'd interrupted.
Oh my, he said with concern. How could I have neglected something so important? Huh?
Adam said in confusion. Cogsworth raised a finger. You two need a chaperone.
A what? Well, we don't want any little princes or princesses, of course, running around before their time, my lord.
Cogsworth explained matter-of-factly.
Adam spluttered, flushing furiously. Cogsworth!
Yes, I must make the arrangements, but I'll be but a moment, Your Highness. The man headed off, unaware he'd said anything amiss. Adam, still bright as a roaring furnace, stared pointedly at the ground. Then, slowly, he glanced back at Belle. They looked at each other for a long moment, and then started into timid chuckles.
That was embarrassing,
Adam admitted. Belle giggled again, hugging his waist. Adam's fingers traced absent circles over her back in return, though he was now staring out towards a group of trees at the base of the nearest hill. Belle followed his gaze, and then looked back at him. He watched the point for another long moment when their eyes met.
What do you say we run away?
He whispered. Belle grinned, recognizing the teasing gleam in his eyes. She nodded. Giles smiled to himself, hidden in the shadow of a large tent at the edge of the camp. He was the first to chaperone the two, as Cogsworth put it. But what his old friend didn't know was that Giles had already had a constant tab on their location. For he was not going to allow their young prince to be lost again. He reached up, turning one of his small golden earrings between two fingers. A nervous habit. Sucking in a breath, he tugged a spyglass from his belt and pulled it open. Through the glass he could just see Olive grazing at the tree line. A motion of two figures disappearing into the canopy's shadows. He chuckled, closing the tool again and sliding it into his belt. If the young people wanted to be alone, they would find a way. Young love was tender that way, and not even Cogsworth could do much to stop it. Smiling a little wistfully, Giles reached a hand into his shirt and pulled forth a locket, hanging on a silver chain. It was round and old, its ornament long since faded. He glanced around and, finding himself alone, flicked it open. A lock of bright red hair encased in dim glass. And though he had looked at it 1,000 times, the sight still made his throat grow tight.
What the hell is wrong with you?
Giles stood tall and alert, knowing anything less would only anger the man more. Yet he couldn't quite find the courage to meet his father's eyes.
We host the Baru family for 6 weeks, and you can't muster up the courage to ask for Lady Marianne's hand? Giles swallowed. Father, I didn't feel it a good match. It was a perfectly good match, his father snarled. And so were the last 4 young women you've managed to offend through your indifference. What's it going to take, he huffed.
Giles' heart was thundering in his chest.
I'm not.
He clenched his fists to hide their trembling and took a breath.
Father, I'm just not sure I want to get married.
As soon as the words came out, he flinched. An old habit. No blow had come for some years now, but he had expected his father to at least yell at him, maybe throw something off the desk. But the man merely grew stone silent. Somehow, that was worse. Giles just stared at the floor, too afraid to look up.
You don't want to get married, his father said finally.
His voice was low, anger boiling just beneath the surface.
And I suppose you don't want to inherit this estate either. Let Cecile inherit. You know as well as I that's impossible, his father growled.
He leaned back in his chair and scoffed.
Damn shame that she wasn't born a man. Girl's more of one than you've ever been.
Giles grit his teeth, eyes burning, hating himself more than even normal.
A man fulfills his duty, his father went on, eyes dark. Does that word mean nothing to you?
Giles' head shot up at that.
It means everything to me, he cried.
Standing from his seat, the man stared at Giles with cold, unloving eyes.
Then you will fulfill your duty to this family.
Giles' eyes grew wide, and he stepped back. He had been honest for his declaration, for duty had run through his veins since birth. Tending to a bedridden mother, quietly overseeing the care and payment of the staff, attending to the needs of the surrounding villages, all the things the aging count before him had neglected for drink and leisure. But this kind of duty... He swallowed.
I can't, he thought desperately. Not this.
His father scoffed at his silence, sitting again and looking away.
You're a fool, and a disgrace. Get out of my sight.
Giles wanted to say something, do anything besides stand there like a coward he was. But instead, he just bowed his head in submission and stepped into the hall. His feet took him to the courtyard, urging him towards the adjacent recreation building and armory. He often came here when he felt alone, for it was the only place that brought him relief, though it wasn't the place itself that offered the cure. The room was wide and open, pleasant light cascading through the windows and glinting off 100 silver swords. In the centre of the room, 2 visiting nobles were decked out in white garb from head to toe, heads shielded by mesh-faced helmets as they sparred with vigour. In the corner stood a servant, 2 spare swords in hand and watching the match with interest. It was this young man who looked up over upon Giles's entry. He was young, like him, but in every other way his opposite. Shorter and broader in stature, with a head of fiery red hair that seemed a physical manifestation of his open-spirited nature. Nothing like Giles, who was prone to keeping every emotion carefully in check. Yes, quite his opposite. And they were the best of friends.
Giles!
The man called out, but quickly stopped, coughing and looking towards the 2 visiting nobles. They hadn't noticed his slip, too engaged in their increasingly violent spar.
Lord Giles,
he corrected as Giles drew near. Jean only used the title when others were around. It was always strange when he did, and they typically joked about it later.
How's this one been?
Giles asked, nodding towards the pair across the room. Jean rolled his eyes.
They're awful,
he droned, immediately losing the formality now that they could talk in confidence. He leaned into Giles so he could whisper,
though I'm certain each thinks of themselves as skilled as King Arthur himself.
Usually Giles would have laughed, but at the moment he couldn't even muster a smile. In all truth, seeing the lingering visitors merely reminded him of his failure with Lady Marianne.
Well, how was it?
Giles prodded, nudging him playfully in the side.
Would you like a go around? Show these amateurs a thing or two?
Finally the smile came.
Yes, let's.
The 2 young men were well matched in skill. It was only because Giles had the advantage of height and light-footedness that he won nearly every match against his friend. And the exercise usually did him good, for it was easy to focus on his form and the way his body felt, moving with speed and precision. But today, Giles couldn't find that focus. Instead, his father's harsh words and his own shame crept back slowly, tangling themselves deep in his chest and allowing Jean to assume the victory.
"First time I've bested you in 6 months,"
Giles panted, tugging off his helmet as they entered the dressing rooms.
"You sure you weren't just going easy on me?"
Giles didn't hear him. He leaned against the wall, sword hanging limply in one hand, face hidden beneath the mask he didn't bother to remove. Giles paused halfway through unbuttoning his jacket, looking back at him in confusion.
"Giles, you okay?"
Giles remained quiet. He wanted so badly to pretend he was fine, but it was taking everything he had just to keep back the foolish tears.
"I can't imagine you're that sort of a loser,"
Jean teased, though it was clear he was straining to keep his voice upbeat as he moved over with caution.
"No," Giles muttered. "It isn't that."
Jean was beside him then. He took the sword from Giles's hand, set it aside, and placed a large, warm hand on his arm. He no longer hid his concern.
"He got mad again, didn't he?"
Giles just shrugged, ducking his head.
"Are you hurt?"
he asked nervously.
"Did he?" "No. He knows I'm stronger than him now."
Giles sighed in relief and let his hand fall away.
"What happened?"
Sighing himself, Giles turned his back to him, tearing off his own jacket and wrestling with the large buttons of his own jacket.
"I'm a failure," he said flatly. "A disgrace to him and to my family."
"What?" Jean breathed in shock. "How could you think that? You're incredible! You're the greatest swordsman in the province, no question. Plus, you see to this entire state and the surrounding villages. I mean, you practically do your old man's job for him."
"None of that matters," Giles replied hollowly. "None of it. Not if I can't produce."
He trailed off, staring at his feet. He sucked in a breath and squeezed his eyes shut. He heard Jean move a pace closer, but stop.
"Giles? He's upset I didn't propose to Lady Marianne,"
he said at last, turning back.
"That's why he was angry."
Jean was quiet for a long moment. "Oh," he whispered. Both looked away. Dusk had begun to creep into the room, its long, shadowy fingers bathing them in darkness. A carriage could be heard rolling down the nearest road. The sound permeated the silent air, then vanished back into the night.
"She was a good woman," Giles admitted at last. "A really good woman, actually. Perhaps I should have married her."
"Why didn't you?" He said it so suddenly, Giles couldn't help but look up. Jean was watching him, eyes wide and anxious in the dim room, pulsing with a vulnerability he had never seen in them before. Giles knew then. Knew why he didn't marry Lady Marianne. Why he didn't marry any of them. In truth, he had known for a long time now, but had buried the truth in a place he hoped would never be discovered, even by himself. Buried the truth that each woman his father placed in his path only filled him with dread. Buried the truth that when he lay in bed at night and closed his eyes, all he saw was that bright red hair and encouraging smile. But the way Jean was looking at him now, maybe he didn't need to hide it anymore. Maybe he wasn't so alone after all. His feet pulled him forward, nearly closing the distance between them. Strange how the insecurity in Jean's eyes gave him courage. Giles had never been the brave one. In fact, a small part of his mind screamed in panic, but the rest of him ignored it as he leaned in closer. Their lips brushed. Barely a kiss, but it was all Giles could muster before the nerves tumbled over him and he turned away. Yet Jean didn't let him go too far, for warm hands found his face and pulled him back in. The warmth seemed to flow from Jean's touch, from his lips, filling Giles's heart like nothing ever had before, filling the emptiness inside and washing away the senseless guilt he had let settle there. They pulled back. The room was growing darker by the minute, but not so dark that Giles couldn't see how Jean's cheeks were starting to match the hue of his hair.
I thought it was just me,
Jean whispered, a strange kind of awe in his voice.
You were sorely mistaken.
Jean blinked once, then laughed, hugging him tightly. Giles returned the embrace, smiling wide and forgotten about his father and his shame, and even, for the first time, that suffocating, ever-present call to duty. Giles sighed roughly, closing the locket with a snap and tugging it back into his shirt. No use dwelling on the past. It was time to focus on those who needed him now. A young couple hidden in the trees, finally together, but still so far from being truly safe. He narrowed his eyes, heart burning. They would not be torn apart again. Not in the way he knew all too well. He would make sure of it. It was such a simple gesture, simple and sweet, and Belle couldn't fathom how it was possibly making her feel the things she was feeling. Adam kissed the tip of her thumb, the last of 5 fingers he had done the very same to, pausing and looking at her from the shadows that fell from the canopy of trees. The palm of her free hand pressed against the thick oak trunk behind her, leaning into it, hoping with a silent stare he had come even closer. He did. Belle should have expected it. Adam exuded an abundance of devotion in everything he did, and enough love to cover a family, a household, and an entire kingdom. Yet for some reason, she hadn't anticipated just how the love he held for her alone could manifest itself as passion. He was kissing the inside of her wrist now. Belle closed her eyes, simply enjoying the feeling, still thoroughly overcome by their new closeness. She recalled their ride to this small grove of trees, his arms reaching around her for the reins, thighs squeezing hers as he gave Olive a kick, the way his fingers brushed her neck as he pulled her hair aside and kissed her cheek from behind. This was new, so new to being able to be with him like this, to have a man, a human man, so close to her. Her heart began to race at the thought. Adam, she reminded herself. It's still Adam. His lips brushed her ear.
I love you,
he said softly. Still his voice, but now his words were followed by a tender kiss against her ear, her jaw, the corner of her mouth. Belle's own words couldn't come. She could manage nothing but a shallow breath before their lips met again. She let the oak behind her steady her, his warm arms around her waist keeping her upright, finally realizing the expression weak knees was much more literal than she had once thought. Adam, she managed at last. He pulled back immediately.
Yes?
Are you? She stopped, looking away with unusual shyness before glancing back up at him. Are you sure you haven't done this before? She finally whispered.
He blinked then, utterly destroying the mood. He snorted. When in the world would I have done this before? When I was dead?
I don't know. Belle laughed. He was beaming, and Belle could see the pride in his eyes even through his amusement. Well, he should be proud of it.
He was quite a good kisser.
Perhaps you're just a natural, she smirked, deciding to feed that pride a bit more. Against his will, the corner of Adam's mouth plucked up further at that. Leaning back down, he wrapped his arms tight around her waist and hummed deeply. Except this was no hum. It was a full-out, rasping growl, one which, to the shock of them both, vibrated from deep within his chest and off the resounding trees.
Adam pulled back immediately, eyes growing wide. That wasn't...
He stopped, coughing into his fist, and pressing 2 fingers against his throat.
I don't know how.
He trailed off again, finally catching her eyes.
Wait a second, he said slowly,
an amused but bewildered smile beginning to creep back over his face.
You liked that, didn't you?
Belle reached up to feel her cheeks. Sure enough, they were hot beneath her fingers. She grimaced. No, I didn't.
Yes, you did,
he cried, now roaring with laughter. I didn't. Oh! Belle exclaimed in utter defeat, flushing and burying her face in her hands. Adam still held her in warm arms, though his body continued to shake in amusement. It was a long minute before he could finally speak.
First the beard.
Adam! He chuckled some more, then finally sighed.
Be honest, did you like me better the other way?
No, she said in some defiance, then stopped, growing somber. I mean, it's just, well, sometimes there's moments where it's harder to reconcile that you're, still you. Adam hummed, pursing his lips as he thought. Then, to Belle's surprise, he grinned.
Perhaps I'm not, he said mischievously.
Belle frowned. What? He leaned to whisper in one ear again.
We best not let the beast find out about this. He won't be very happy.
Oh, Adam! Belle cried. That is not funny! He only snickered, growling again and hugging her tight. Belle tried in earnest to reprimand him, but it was difficult to do so through her own laughter. Well, one thing's for certain, she managed, pulling back and raising a brow. It really is still you. I've never met a bigger tease in all my life.
I'm telling you, you started it with all of those awful nicknames.
I thought they were clever. Adam's expression finally softened.
Belle, I have to know. What were you... He paused. What were you thinking? I mean, about me, he said, looking away. About us. Before you knew I could change back.
Belle realised just what he meant, looking away herself. Well, I knew we couldn't leave, since you were trapped there. And I suppose we'd have to, decide together what we'd want to... She stopped, wringing her hands together in the fabric at her waist. I mean, I thought perhaps if we ever, if we ever wanted to, there's an orphanage in Saint-Amand. We could have... Adam watched her as she fell quiet again. He looked stunned.
You thought about that?
Belle flushed, embarrassed, realising the territory they had crossed into with this conversation. Not just the talk of physicality, but the implication of marriage that lingered just beneath her words. Of course, they had freed him and 100 others with their declaration of love, with a silver cord between their chests as proof. But their lives beyond the present was still a topic neither had breached. No, he did, Belle remembered, thinking back to the words of a letter she had read each day while he was gone.
I admit I imagined spending a life with you.
Belle looked up at him again, his eyes the same as the day she had first made that note of them. It really was him, the Adam she'd known. There was no need to hesitate, was there? He spoke first.
Belle, I would never have let things go so far if I didn't think I would be human again. I couldn't resign you to a fate with a monster.
Belle's heart sank a little. Don't say that, she whispered.
It's true, though, he said seriously. You deserve someone who can give you everything, not just part.
He looked back at his feet.
I'm just really glad that, maybe, that someone can be me now.
Belle only stared at him. Did he still not understand? Adam, she said quietly, you were always going to be that someone. He looked up, uncertain. She swallowed, reaching around him and gathering the fabric of his shirt between her fingers. I just wanted you back, she whispered. I didn't care how. Adam breathed shallowly for a moment, then hugged her back tightly.
You're the best, he said happily.
I am not, Val said, pulling away and beginning to count on her fingers. I'm stubborn and impatient and horribly defiant and...
No. You have, by far, the most beautiful heart in the world, he insisted. That makes you the best.
Val shook her head at him, but smiled all the same.
Besides, I like that you're defiant, he went on. He smirked. Like how you insisted on helping me bind up all that wheat, and we got drenched from that storm.
Belle bit her lip and giggled. I'd nearly forgotten about that.
Or demanding that you help me with the index. And then making me reorganize the romance novels.
Oh, you didn't mind.
Or wandering around the palace alone, even though we lost you about 12 times.
Belle nudged him playfully. Come on, she said. We should go back. I don't want the others to worry. They ran back the way they had come, emerging from the small grove of trees' dark cover, and finding Olive still munching happily on the grass. Helping Belle into the saddle, Adam paused with his hand on the leather horn.
So, what if I had been cursed into something entirely different? He asked curiously. Like a frog.
Belle laughed. Now that's just silly.
No, it isn't,
he insisted.
He raised a finger. There's a book about it in the library. Princess and the Frog reference? I approve.
Adam huffed some of the hair from his face.
Ironically, he felt more like a strange creature on display now
than when he was 8 foot tall and covered in fur. 2 old, wrinkled hands moved up his chest. The 2 he wished they were sat motionless in the lap beside him as Belle watched Agatha work with nervous eyes. The old woman was currently prodding Adam all over as he lay on a mat in one of the smaller tents, wearing nothing but his breeches rolled up past his knees, while Dr. Matthews and both his parents sat close by. He stared at the ceiling, bashful to be in such a state of undress with so many prying eyes. But those caring for him seemed too concerned with his health to pay much attention to his dignity at the moment. Agatha's hand pressed over his stomach and his heart, then paused at his throat.
Oh, ho, ho, ho! Well, that's interesting. What? Adam asked nervously. Looks as though your vocal cords aren't quite back to normal.
Adam and Belle exchanged a look.
Oh, that is interesting, he replied.
Belle hid a knowing smile behind her hand. Agatha continued down his arms next.
You know, you've actually gained a bit of an advantage from this whole business. I have? What? Your bones, she explained, lifting his form and squinting at it curiously. As you changed back, they broke, reformed, and broke again, reshaping into their present structure.
Belle and his mother both gasped in unison, and Adam only sighed.
That explains a lot,
he muttered. In a way, he was almost grateful to Cersei for sending him ahead in time. Couldn't imagine having to go through all of that for months. Though, of course, it would have been nice to avoid the curse in the first place. Jacqueline was not so easily placated.
Oh, my poor baby,
she said, looking near tears as she swept the hair from his eyes.
Mama, I'm fine,
Adam said in earnest, glancing over at Belle, who was squeezing his own hand tight, amid a horrified expression of her own.
Belle, it's all right, really,
he insisted.
I mean, when I got shot in the leg, it hurt for a lot longer, so... You were shot in the leg?
Jacqueline cried. Adam cringed, forgetting Mammal hadn't heard that one yet.
No. Okay, yes, but... Hush now, I haven't gotten to the best part,
Agatha demanded. They fell silent, looking back at her at once. She cleared her throat.
As the bones reformed, they also condensed, she explained. Instead of reabsorbing the bone, it seems your body used the most of it to create a new skeleton. Which means these bones are dense. Nearly unbreakable, in fact.
Dr. Matthews leaned in, holding a monocle up to one eye.
Remarkable,
he observed. His father moved closer as well, a hand to his chin.
Indeed. That could certainly come in handy, son.
Agatha nodded.
Yes, yes. In fact, he could probably take a rather nasty fall and still survive.
Well, let's not encourage that, please, Jacqueline said in earnest. His mother's concern was not unwarranted. For at this revelation, Adam had almost immediately wondered if he could still get away with jumping over the western balcony. Pondering the prospect, he held out one arm and flexed it in assessment. She said your bones, not your muscles, Belle whispered, poking him in the stomach and causing him to recoil. For some reason, though, she looked flushed.
Well, everything seems fine for now, but I'd like to continue checking you over for the next few weeks,
Agatha said, pulling away and washing her hands in a nearby basin.
Circe may be a talented sorceress, but she's inexperienced. It's uncertain if she performed the spell with full care.
Great, Adam thought to himself.
Otherwise, do you have any concerns? Agatha asked.
Adam started to shake his head, then stopped.
Actually, there is one thing.
He sat up and glanced behind him.
I, still feel it.
Agatha asked.
My tail,
he said, scratching the back of his head a little sheepishly as he went on.
I swear it's still there, but every time I check, of course, it isn't. Ah, the phantom limb,
Dr. Matthews observed, nodding his head. Quite common when men lose their arms and legs in battle.
It's just... it itches,
Adam admitted, resisting the urge to reach back and scratch at the empty air.
The sensation will go away with time, Agatha explained. Nothing we can do about it for now.
Adam nodded.
Thank you, Agatha, for everything. It's Nana, child, she exclaimed.
Then she smiled.
And you're welcome.
She paused, looking like she wanted to say more, but simply sighed and pushed herself to her feet. Belle helped her up, walking her to the door. Adam rolled his pants back down roughly before grabbing his shirt. Something crinkled in his fingers then, and he remembered.
Belle?
He called out. She turned back, looking curious. Agatha patted her arm and moved through the entrance without her, followed by the others. Is everything all right? Belle asked. He quickly pulled his shirt on, head popping out of the top before he tugged something from his pocket and moved over beside her.
I need your help, he said. My parents plan to do most of the big speeches everywhere we go, but, they wanted me to say something too.
He stopped, handing her the parchment.
Could you make sure it's okay?
Oh, of course, Belle said. She took the sheet willingly and began to read. 10 seconds passed in silence. Then another. Adam cringed.
It's awful, isn't it?
He said. Belle looked up, as if broken from a reverie. What? Oh, no, it's...
I probably went a little overboard on the ending, he said quickly.
Adam!
And maybe I shouldn't have.
Adam! Belle said firmly, stopping him with a hand to his arm. This is really wonderful. I've rarely read such a heartfelt speech.
He blinked. Really?
Mm-hmm, she hummed, looking back down. Here, I think we just need to use simpler language in a few places, since your audience will be mostly uneducated. But other than that, I say keep it just as it is. Adam nodded.
Okay.
He watched her move towards a nearby desk, grabbing a quill and making a few revisions. He slowly followed.
Thank you,
he said belatedly. Belle chuckled. Of course. She looked up then and frowned. Are you all right?
He sighed, looking away. I don't know. I'm really nervous all of a sudden, he admitted. I haven't been around people in so long. I mean, people I don't know. People my age, but besides you. Even when I was a child, I rarely left the castle. He looked up then. What if I make a bad impression, or do something wrong, or offend someone, or... Oh, God. What if, because of me, everyone hates us, and won't help, and...
Adam, Belle said in earnest, squeezing his arm again. Stop worrying so much. You're going to be just fine. You're a very likable person, you know. She smiled. He just shrugged. And, she added, perhaps you'll make some new friends. Adam perked up. He hadn't considered that. He smiled at the thought.
Yeah, maybe I will.
Despite his nerves, the ride towards their first destination was a thrill. Adam, to his guards' dismay, frequently urged Olive into a sprint away from their party for a better view of the countryside, gallivanting up rocky cliffs and through shallow streams. Everything was so open. Apple orchards and rows of lavender and sunflowers stretching on for miles, the sky a wide open bowl of blues and whites. He sucked in a breath of sweet air and smiled. It really did feel good to be free.
Berugeville is just ahead, Your Highness,
Giles noted, a subtle attempt to discourage him from breaking away from the group yet again. Belle rode to Adam's right, grinning to herself. No doubt she had caught Giles's intention as well. She glanced at the approaching town, then over at him. How are you feeling? She asked quietly. His nerves were back now, though his excitement didn't fade away completely. He just shrugged.
I haven't been here in 20 years, Giles said, humming to himself. A beautiful town from what I recall. And... He trailed off, slowing his own horse as they approached the main road. Giles stared at what was before them, eyes growing wide. Oh, God in heaven, he rasped. Adam followed his gaze, and suddenly his nervousness was gone. Gone and replaced by horror. Dilapidated houses, roofs sinking in, a stinking ditch through the street's centre, overflowing with what Adam could only hope was mud. A few skinny children ran along its bank, one or two adults trudging close by. But the mass of them sat along the abandoned storefronts and alleyways, some coughing fiercely, others staring ahead as though on the precipice of death. Their party had stopped, each slowly dismounting their rides and staring at the scene before them. Adam's heart seemed to still, his mouth growing dry. How can we ask these people to fight? He asked hollowly. They're sick and starving, living in their own. He couldn't continue, swallowing back the bile in his throat. Perusville used to be quite prosperous, Cogsworth said, his own eyes wide with shock. What happened? Adam's father moved beside them, narrowing his eyes. Victor happened, he said darkly. Be careful, mademoiselle. Adam whipped his head back at the call. Across the road, Belle sat crouched in the muddy street, unscrewing the cap of her water canteen with frantic fingers and lifting it to a woman's lips. The woman was propped against the wall, skin pale and grey, barely responding to the offering. A child watched numbly, small fingers resting on the woman's arm. Mademoiselle, said one of the guards again, approaching Belle with caution. Please, you could get sick. Agatha! Belle cried out, ignoring him. Someone find her, please! Adam had taken but a step towards her when he felt her tugging at his jacket. Looking down, he saw a boy staring up at him with hollow, empty eyes. He seemed to be around ship's age, yet couldn't have been half his weight. Spare a coin, my lord? Throat growing tight. Adam turned around, dug into his saddlebag, and pulled out a handful of gold. The boy watched it place him in his hands with wide eyes. He stared at the gift for a long moment, then looked back up at him. Who are you? He asked in amazement. Adam started. He swallowed. I'm Prince Adam. A prince? Adam nodded slowly. I was locked away for a long time, but we're going to make things better now. The once dead look in the boy's eyes was gone,
replaced by an eager brightness, and with it a smile. Without another word he raced away, soon surrounded by a dozen other children, whom he willingly offered a part of his new fortune. Each stared at their new coin, crying out with excitement and turning to look back at their new prince. Not one looked like they'd eaten a full meal in months. Adam sucked in a shaky breath and turned to look around in desperation.
"Cogsworth," he said in earnest, "we have to. We need to feed them,"
he said frantically. Cogsworth frowned, looking across the street. He seemed troubled.
"We're here to recruit, Your Highness. I suggest we move on for now. See if we don't find better success elsewhere."
Adam stared at him.
How can you say that?" he said in shock. "How can we just abandon them like this?" "My lord, our provisions are not infinite," Cogsworth said carefully. "Circumstances being what they are, we can't really afford to." "Damn it, Cogsworth!" Adam cried. "We can skip a few dinners. Give them something to eat."
Cogsworth fell silent. He sighed, bowing shallowly, and left to obey. Adam felt a hand on his shoulder, turning quickly to see his father looking at him with concern.
"Don't be too hard on old Cogsworth,"
he told Adam quietly.
"He's doing his best to keep this mission afloat. And, in truth, we can't do much to help these people until we have control of this kingdom once again."
Adam's shoulders sagged, looking back to where Cogsworth had left, and feeling a sting of regret for his harshness.
"I guess," he admitted, I can't bear to just leave here without doing anything to help." "We'll do what we can today," Alexander agreed. "And when this is all over, we'll be able to do much more."
Adam nodded, looking back at the people of Perugeville. All his regrets and fears staring him in the face. All those years trapped at the palace, knowing he should be serving his people and fearing what was happening to them. And now he saw it with his own eyes, and it was worse than he had imagined. How many had starved, fallen to disease, and died during his years away? He looked back at Belle, at the hungry child at her side, and the sick mother in her arms. Then suddenly he saw Belle as she had been on the first day they had met, arms thin and cheeks hollow. He recalled the sight of her mother through Adam's mirror, sick and dying. Gone because this kingdom had fallen to ruin. Gone because Victor had abused his power and allowed his people to wallow in sickness and starvation. Gone because Cersei had interfered and given him that power in the first place. Adam was clenching his fists, finally making the connection.
Cersei killed Belle's mother. Cersei killed them all.
And suddenly, he was no longer nervous. He was furious. He looked down at his claws. No, fingers now, he remembered, frowning deeply. It seemed he would need an upgrade. At the edge of camp stood one of the largest tents. Within, pandemonium, pounding of metal on metal, shouts for another order, flames bursting into life from 3 separate pits. A few days had passed since Perugeville, and while the other towns held their own share of struggles, a surprising number of citizens had already stepped up to King Alexander's cause. Most of these volunteers, however, came without their own means to fight, necessitating the temporary smithy. Adam now stepped inside with some apprehension, eyes searching the space bustling with men of all sizes, and even a few women, none of them seemed to notice that he was there. Finally, his eyes caught a familiar face. A boy sitting in the corner, watching with wide, fascinated eyes, as one of their blacksmiths pulled a flaming red sword from the nearby furnace.
"Chip," Adam said, moving over, "do you know where your papa is?"
Chip tore his gaze from the scene. "Over there," he said happily, pointing a rather vague direction. His eyes quickly returned to the man's work, who was now ramming a hammer against the hot blade. Adam scanned the crowd again, finally catching sight of Henry surrounded by a dozen others on the opposite side of the tent. As he wove his way over, he saw that Henry was fitting each of these men to a weapon, and in some cases a breastplate or other armour. Henry glanced up then, sleeves rolled up well past his elbows, every inch of him covered in soot that made his usually blonde hair appear black.
"Ah, your highness," he said,
waving him over. Adam, dodging a man rushing past with a hot fire tongue, managed to make his way through the small crowd that had parted ways for him.
"Hey, Henry," he said, nodding towards the barrel of swords close by. "I know you're really busy, but do you think I could get one of those?"
Henry grinned and nodded, but instead of moving towards the barrel, he dismissed the others and led Adam towards the far corner. Here lay dozens of carefully wrapped cases, and after looking through them for a minute, Henry pulled one out, unbinding the thick leather and turning back, displaying the long sword pressed in his palms.
"Here you are, my lord."
The weapon had a smooth, black, traditional handle, reinforced with gold, and was contained in a case of red leather, the colours of his family crest. Adam picked it up slowly, pulling the long blade free. Symbols of the royal coat of arms and a pattern of the sacred fleur-de-lis lilies were carved by a talented hand right into its silver surface, which shone bright even in the dim shop.
"Whoa!"
he breathed, holding it up to the firelight and admiring it with awe. It felt sturdy, but not burdensome, somehow fitting perfectly in his grip.
"You didn't expect me to give just any old sword to my prince, did you?" Henry chuckled.
Adam looked back at him.
"But how did you know?"
"The old commander told me you'd been wanting one," Henry shrugged.
"He did?"
A few minutes later, Adam approached the temporary training area. Nothing more than an open area of grass where some 24 men paired off to practice. Nearly twice as many who were practicing, however, had gathered to watch a single spar separated from the rest. When Adam moved over to investigate, they scattered.
Apologies, your highness,"
one of the smaller fellows said, tipping his hat nervously.
"It's just not every day you see a lady do such things."
Adam cocked his head.
"Huh? What's your footing, my dear?"
someone was saying. Adam looked over, mouth falling open in surprise. There stood Belle, feet apart, breathing hard, none other than a sword of her own in her hand. Giles stood across from her, appearing much more relaxed as he gave her instructions. Belle huffed, clearly frustrated with whatever mistake she had made. She scrunched up her face as she repositioned her feet. Adam moved closer. "Oh, Adam!" she flushed, catching sight of him and straightening quickly. She brought a hand to the back of her neck, looking away.
"This is new," he hummed warmly.
She shrugged. "Sorry I didn't mention it. It's just... I suppose it's a bit unladylike to learn such things."
Adam didn't think so at all. In fact, he thought it was wildly attractive.
It didn't help that wisps of her long plaited hair were sticking against her neck, skin glistening in the sunlight. He shook his head.
"No, I mean, it's good,"
he said belatedly. "I shouldn't really have to use it," Belle went on, "but Giles thought it would be a good idea to learn anyhow."
"It is a good idea,"
Adam agreed. He motioned to her weapon.
"Can I see it?"
She nodded, handing it over. "Henry made it for me," she explained.
"He made me one too."
He pulled his new blade from his belt, letting her hold it. He noticed immediately the similarities between the two. While Bell's sword was obviously shorter and lighter, they were both patterned using the same colours and materials. Belle's blade only missed the carvings of the royal emblems. For now, Adam thought to himself. "You better start practicing if you want to catch up with me," Belle said then, eyes bright and teasing. Adam only smiled at that, for he knew something Belle didn't. "You already knew how!" she cried a minute later. Adam grinned, sword held aloft, already having parried off several of Giles's attacks. An innate, probably immature part of him liking showing off for Belle, and so found her surprise all the more entertaining.
"Our prince took after his father as a boy," Giles explained. "Watched the king and I spar but once, and wouldn't leave me alone until I took him on as my student." I wanted to be an explorer, Adam shrugged, glancing back at Belle. And everyone knows you can't be a good explorer without fighting off pirates and cannibals.
Belle laughed. You probably never guessed it would be witches you'd be fighting off instead.
Adam grimaced. True. Come, my prince, Giles said from behind them. You maintained much muscle memory, but I'm afraid you're still quite rusty.
Adam nodded. He gave Belle a quick kiss, his new favourite thing to do, then resumed his stance as she wandered off towards her tent to bathe. Giles settled into his own relaxed position, lifting up the old sword he had once occupied.
Belle has done surprisingly well in so short a time, he observed. Of course she has, Adam said. She's Belle.
No. Giles chuckled at that, blocking several of Adam's attempts to disarm him. Adam scrunched up his face in concentration, but went on.
The thing is, I know Belle's capable, and I promised we'd face everything together from now on. But... he sighed,
pulling back a bit.
I can't help but want to keep her as far away from all of this until the danger is gone.
A look flashed on Giles' face, one Adam didn't understand. He was still getting used to everyone's new expressions, after all.
A natural wish, I think,
Giles agreed after a moment. Given he seemed distracted, Adam bolted forward to take advantage of the opening. He swung with all his might, but the old commander stepped out of his way with ease. Adam yelped, crashing into the fence behind him. Giles simply looked amused.
Ah, my prince. Remember,
he noted,
victory isn't determined by brute strength.
Feeling a little sheepish, Adam stood and brushed himself off before trying again.
Is that what you're teaching Belle?
He asked, turning to starting up the spar again.
Indeed, as well as...
batting Adam's strikes us away. He then coughed into his free hand.
Well, men do have one particularly weak spot that can be taken advantage of.
Adam, realizing what he meant, paused right in their fight.
Giles, he said, beginning to smile slowly, did you teach Belle to fight dirty? I taught her how to protect herself,
Giles corrected, raising a finger. Adam thought back to one freezing winter night, of bruises so deep in her skin not even the darkest shadows could hide them. He narrowed his eyes.
Good.
End of chapter. Or rather, end of part 1. Hi guys, hope you enjoyed this. I have to cut this short, I'm afraid. Again, these final chapters are getting really long. I think I might cut the epilogue into bits as well. Anyway, wow, yeah, I love this. Their absolute determination to help people is something I find so admirable. Anyway, you guys know the drill. Like, comment and subscribe and hit that bell to get notified whenever I upload a new video. Have a good day, night or whatever time zone you're in. Take care, my guys, gals and non-binary pals. I'll see you in another video. Bye!